like us, you love a good single player story game, then here are a couple of our favorites that we're going to talk through today, and there are just hundreds and hundreds on the Xbox game library. We would love to know what some of yours are, but yeah, let's have a yap about some of our favorite single player story games. Sound good?
Watch out for spoilers. There might be some.
Let's talk about a saucy one first. One that I've recently picked up.
In what way?
Well,
Oh, I know.
depends on the player.
Yeah, okay.
One that I recently started, but it's by no means a newer release. Out last year, Baldur's Gate 3. Now, maybe like me, you haven't, gotten around to picking up one of the most acclaimed games of 2023.
Genuinely is. Sweeping the awards season. Deservedly so. It's an amazing game.
Amen. And it's still being updated all the time, which is very exciting. There's a new update coming, including new classes and such. But I've recently, sipped the tea and fallen down the rabbit hole of Baldur's Gate 3, which to my delight has worked out perfectly because while all of my spare moments are now surrounded by my party, I couldn't be happier. Really, really cannot express how incredible this story is to play through by your own terms because of the nature of Baldur's Gate 3, where it is pretty much a D&D adventure where you choose absolutely all of your actions. The customization and of how you want to play it is almost endless, as much as it could be endless by the parameters of modern technology or whatever. And that, to me, is a fascinating way. We'll talk about some other games that are obviously very set on rails story-wise, and while I absolutely have had amazing experiences with them, to come across a game that I am so obsessed with the world that has been built around me and the characters that I come across and wanting to find out more about each individual person, but still at the same time having my own agency as I would maybe like learning about the story of our culture or the world, or it really does feel like I'm in the least weird parasocially sounding way. It really feels like I'm connecting with these NPCs and stuff as I would real human beings, which is just a delight to really find in a game while having this huge epic storyline in the background as well.
That overarching story is like the vehicle that allows you to then experience the rest of what's going on in the world. Like every corridor you go down, every home you walk into, and there are people there that you can talk to. There are micro pockets of story happening there that tend to be the ones that stick with you the most, or like certain scenarios that happen that you can say, yeah, while I was on this journey to basically save the world, I also happened to talk to this little squirrel or talk to this little rat, or there was like a little gnome dude that wanted me to help him find like a shoe or whatever it happened to be. Those are the little bits of the story that stick with you for ages, and you're constantly thinking, what could I have done differently? And the fact that Baldur's Gate 3 has so many branching paths, not only depending on the decisions you've made in the moment, but decisions you've made in character creation, decisions you've made prior in terms of what kind of relationship you've built with the rest of your party members or important NPCs in the story, will drastically alter the path that you go down and change the entire story to a degree. There's, with a lot of games like this, there's a few endings to find, depending on how you play it. But that's not what I'm most interested in actually finding out, because A, it's such a great game, I want it to kind of go on forever, and it will have to end eventually. But B, it's just all the little checkpoints and crossroads along the way that are just adding up into this really fleshed out and just vivid story. It's not just I'm a passenger to this, it's I'm actually part of what's making this story come to life. I'm helping write it along the way with 100%. All of these characters I'm traveling with, and it's let alone the fact all the mechanics are incredible and the gameplay part of it is awesome. It's just the fact that this is a grand story that involves you, and it makes it feel like a much more deeper connection because of that.
That's a really good point, because when we think about why we actually enjoy single player story games. I want to say it's probably because, the same reason we would enjoy the plot of a movie or the plot of a book and things like that. And with gaming as a media, it's a huge testament to the writing team at Larian that they've got their storyline is locked in, and I want to find out what happens through that, as well as, like you say, going off all the different side tracks and side lines and finding out about each individual person. I actually care about every single thing that comes across, but at the same time, I'm looped back into the story. So I never lose sight of that, which I think is really important to having a strong story game that you want to complete. As well as having all of those mechanics really open it up to you. Is really interesting. The same way, like, you can enjoy the visuals of a movie, or how, the acting of actors within gaming and within other video formats, they all still then add to this story. And I think it, as a complete package, is vastly different from a lot of other story games that I've enjoyed and played, but really carries on like almost perfectly. I can't say perfection, but I think it's pretty as close as I could say. Yeah.
I also just respect a story game that lets me choose if I think a character's important enough to live.
Yeah.
Shadowheart, you're not that cool.
No!
You're gone. Bye.
Take it back.
Nope, she's dead. Gone. And it's a great story because of it. Well, I'll bring a different game to the conversation then, and it's maybe a bit obvious.
You think on that, boy?
But it's Red Dead 2.
It's this boy.
Red Dead Redemption 2, I think, is like the pinnacle of Rockstar's storytelling ability, in that this is a time period I can never ever really experience, and yet you are thrust into that world at that time and fully just soaked in a bit of realism, as well as, in typical Rockstar fashion, a bit of ridiculousness, because this is an absurd story that you go on. But along the way, you build such a deep connection with the characters that you're journeying with in Red Dead 2, the character you're playing as Arthur Morgan. Honestly, I think it's so deep, and there's nothing too deep about his character portrayal whatsoever. You're getting every aspect of this man's life, the thoughts that he's going through, the fact he has a journal that he records stuff in, that you can get like a deeper sort of look into how he feels about what just happened, is like a really intimate connection. Because, people say like peeking into someone's diary is like a huge invasion of privacy. The fact that we get to see what he's really thinking, that he's not maybe brave enough to tell someone, just scrawled out for you, is really cool, really personal. And then you build a connection with the land itself. You're just journeying through America and seeing the changes that it's going through. It's like the time period that you're at in Red Dead 2 it's that turn of the century. The ways of the Old West are dying out, and there are people who are still stuck and rooted in that traditionalism that are now trying to find their new place in the world. How do they live? How do they find that American dream in an America that is not for them anymore? And that's a really cool, quite jarring and quite harsh world to be living in, especially one for an outlaw who already was kind of hated by a lot of people, but now is, depending on how you play it, trying to either change tact or double down on being even more of a evil person. So yeah, it's a gorgeous story. There is no way, whichever way you decide to play it, whether you are just sticking with the outlaw route and gunning down innocent people and stealing from people, or whether you're deciding to try and change Arthur's life around, make him a good man, you'll be brought to tears by the end of this story. It's emotive on a different level to anything I've played before. It's unbelievable.
I think on that, I think it's worth noting, a lot of these titles are probably ones that you've heard of before, but I'd be really curious to hear if you've actually played it to completion as well, because even though Red Dead Redemption 2 and the first game as well have been out for quite a number of years now, they really still hold up in terms of big hitting story games. And adversely to Baldur's Gate 3 and games of the such, like, you know, we'll probably talk about some Elder Scrolls games or other RPGs that you play your own hero, following, I love what you said, like Arthur's story, and just becoming so, you know, it like intertwined with him and his thoughts, and becoming, I guess, him. And it's a beautiful tale of just this, you know, just your average kind of guy of the time, but he's such it really, it shows me like quite a lot of compassion, I guess, and empathy, and like finding, like putting yourself into his shoes really shows like a really lovely tale that we can then take and apply to like a lot of other people that we come across, or, you know, stories that we can enjoy. But like you say, it's also a tale of a whole region, country at the time and stuff. And Rockstar have obviously absolutely nailed just that iconic era of cowboys, and it's something that is, you know, kind of it reminds me so much of like my dad, and like he grew up on like cowboy western movies and stuff like that, and he absolutely loves the Red Dead games, as do I. But it's so interesting to see something that is as grand and spanning almost as these huge games like Baldur's Gate 3, like huge games that are coming out, Yakuza games that are coming out, while still being so what's the word, like intimate, because it is, you're just coming along with Arthur's journey and following that, and it is really nice. The lack of choice doesn't remove anything there. There's not, it doesn't feel like you're missing out because of, you know, whatever. You can't exactly blow up a barrel of oil or something outside of, well, you actually could. Never mind.
Could.
The parallels are quite there.
They do quite well with allowing some player agency in the way that you tackle certain story beats. What I love though is the amount of activities you can do outside of the main story. Feel like, this is me getting another chance to spend a bit more time with Arthur and his companions, doing something other than, you know, heisting a train, or you know, occasionally you just want to explore some of the world around you, and like the map is huge enough that you'd forgive them for not finding enough stuff to put in it, but they have done that. They've fleshed every area of the map out, and there'll be little side stories or like points of interest that you can just go to and experience a taste of the life back then. And then there are other ones that are slightly more exciting, like there'll be like a serial killer that you can kind of follow and see if you can find out like the mystery of who is this serial killer, or there'll be like just little pocket incidences that happen where you might see some like white supremacists over there who are trying to set a cross on fire, but then they manage to set themselves on fire because they're all idiots. And it's just brilliant little moments that you're like, wow, this is such a cool peek into life back then. And then how it all relates back to Arthur, because he'll always have like his little comment on something. He'll always have like a little line where he's just bemused by something, confused by something, finds something funny, irritated, you know. And it's, this is storytelling that invites you along with it, not just tells it to you, which is a beautiful way to communicate it. Yeah.
In another direction of what makes good story games, or how they can be displayed to players and stuff like that, JRPGs, I mean, there's so many incredible storylines throughout hundreds of thousands of fantastic JRPG games, but specifically more recently anyway, we can talk about Persona, the series, as well as one from last year, Metaphor ReFantazio, which I very much enjoyed. But a kind of a key title for the Persona series that most people will probably have either been introduced to if they're more, you know, the modern gamer, or have at least heard of Persona 5 Royal, especially when that came to Xbox last year. And that tells the story of one, you follow the protagonist's story in a sense that it's still Joker, it's still him, and you get to see the world through his eyes. But you also have these, you know, band of compatriots, similar to like a party, I guess, in in Baldur's Gate 3 and what we're talking about with those characters. You get to know them because you're literally, as mechanics of the game, spending time with them and wanting to know more about their story. But you also have almost like a double-edged storyline where you've got your normal high schooler day-to-day kind of life that you need to leave, and that is so in-depth in what you can do throughout, as if you're just basically role-playing a normal teenager in Japan and going to school, having to complete quizzes, dealing with high school, or like hanging out at the coffee shop and things like that. But then on the other side, you have this super dark fantasy, like high fantasy, like almost otherworldly, a mix of sci-fi almost in there as well, with all of the demons and personas that you need to take on in the other world and in your nighttime dream world, which brings around even more complexity to story games in general, in that it's not just a start, middle and end. You've also got the flip side too, which is very interesting. It can be a bit more, I would say, not to put you off, but it can sometimes feel a bit overwhelming, I guess, with games like this, when especially if you're not used to playing these sorts of games. Like maybe you are used to playing a game that's, you know, a fantastic story, but it's like 20-30 hours long, and then that's it. You start, middle and end it. Persona, and maybe actually Metaphor specifically, Metaphor ReFantazio, does a really good job of like showing, easing players into the genre as a whole. And Atlas just do a fantastic job of, for me anyway, I find it way more approachable than other JRPGs where you're maybe not used to getting your story through, you know, hours and hours of cutscenes if you've not been playing the Metal Gear games growing up or something like that. And this is, you know, your first introduction to it. Metaphor ReFantazio does a really good job of easing you in with familiar gaming mechanics and storytelling traditionally, as well as mixing it through dialogue, cutscenes, and even through the battles as well. Like your turn-based battles, storytelling through those can be such an interesting part of it as well. I think within story games, there's maybe other examples we can use to chat about this, but what I'd be keen to hear from you guys watching, as well as your thoughts, Henry, is like, how do you like your story delivered to you? Because there's a lot of argument for, I mean, some of my favorite games obviously are the Dark Souls series, sure, any Souls games. But
you got to really work for the story.
You got to work for the story.
Yeah, it's on you to find out. You got to read every piece of paper, talk to every person, you know, which are things that are removed from the gameplay element of it. If you want to tap into the story, it's strict. I quite like when there's similarly to Persona, I suppose. I like when there's sort of a dual or parallel kind of stories going on. So in Persona, you have your high school life, and then you have your crazy other dimension life. And a game that somewhat does this dual narrative thing that I really enjoy the way they deliver that story is Alan Wake 2.
Nice.
Because the fact that you get Alan's perspective and then you get Saga Anderson's perspective at the same time, that eventually converge onto a point so that you get the fuller picture of what the whole story is, I think is a really powerful way to drip feed you important parts of the story, keep you intrigued and always wondering, oh, what does that mean? Or, oh, that's what that was in that other person's story. Now it's starting to come together. And it makes you feel smart.
Yeah.
It makes you feel intelligent. I think that's really important to, if mystery is a part of like your story genre, then making the player feel smart every now and then is an important way of keeping them hooked in the mystery, because it feels like they are earning something from it, like they're succeeding at something, even if it's just to understand the story. It makes you feel great when you do that. And so Alan Wake 2 is a great way of doing that. Having a dual narrative, having parallel narratives, thinking of other ways of doing it. I quite like when there's anthology style games. So one that I really enjoyed, and it's not a huge game by any means, probably only take about 3 hours to finish, is Stories Untold. Because it's an anthology of sort of horror game experiences that you then come to find out it's one connected story that you're experiencing. And so telling these little pocket stories that are just great in their own right, eerie, ambient, delivered in very different ways, all different genres of games at the same time, so you're kind of getting a taste of everything, and then being sort of clever enough to realize, like, wow, this was one story I was experiencing, but telling it in a very cryptic way, but with just enough breadcrumbs that you picked up on all the clues as well. So games like that I think are excellent, when there's multiple narratives that you then piece together yourself to find a bigger, deeper one.
Do you know what else is like that? Resident Evil games. Same with like Alan Wake. You almost have that two protagonists, two different storylines parallel, depending on how you play it as well, or who you choose to play it at the start of it. Resident Evil 2 is probably one of my favorite horror games still, but I think that's, it's interesting because it's because of the narrative and it's because of them too that I like the game. It's not necessarily like, I've been jump scared quite a bit by Resident Evil, but it's not
as it should be.
As it should
Scary
be.
Game.
But like learning about them and following their like journey through Raccoon City and the aftermath, and learning about, the outbreak through that game. It's just so iconic. Like there's a reason that the remaster is still so good, and still the series is still so relevant right now in horror as well as just gaming as a whole.
Hugely influential.
And again, that has like quite an interesting like storyline that obviously carries across all of the games almost, and the characters, returning or appearing throughout that too. But it's really interesting to pick up on bits like hand-fed you almost, as well as you were saying, working out, picking up little clues in the environment or in dialogue between the characters, or even bits of paper that you pick up, or like,
I think horror games are really good at doing that in general. Like, we both love horror games, and I think there's always that classic trope. You see it in Dead Space quite often. It's like Captain's log, the experiment is going well. All that kind of flavor text that you're getting through, like, here's what happened before everything went awful, because you're now getting there when everything is awful, and you're wondering, like,
what
how
happened?
did this happen? Like, your mind is instantly intrigued by that, and so horror games have that advantage of being able to put in those little bits of lore that tell you, like, man, life was pretty good until some idiot probably did an experiment and just ruined everything for everyone. That's always like a fun. It clings you onto the story more, because you're searching for just bits of information that do fill in the gaps of your knowledge, and like, how did it get to this? And sometimes you find like a gameplay mechanic in that, like, it will say, oh, these guys they don't seem to like the light or whatever. And so you're like, oh, cool. So I'll use I have a flashlight. I guess I should use it. And that happens to be like a clue in on some of the gameplay mechanics, but it's also story building and world building as well that is fun to learn about. Yeah.
Heck yeah.
Yeah, horror games are good for that. I think Outlast is, I've not played as much of it. What I have played, what I really enjoyed about how Outlast delivers the story is the fact that you have a camcorder. So you obviously don't always have to use it, but just the pure motion of flipping up to the camcorder makes me feel like I'm actually making a story right now.
Yeah.
And that makes me care more about seeing where it goes.
Yeah.
It's that simple, and it's such a simple trick that I feel like I'm making a found footage movie right now. I'm so invested in this. It's really cool. I know you've played a lot more of it, so I don't know how the story entirely transpires, but that's a really cool mechanic.
I'll have to play it to find out. Do you know, now that I think about it as well, something that's like Outlast story is so interesting for the player to kind of follow, is probably because of how adversely to, like, a lot of other sort of games that are completely a fiction and so far removed from our worlds that we can't really even like comprehend that being a reality. So that's quite fun for like,
that's what makes them interesting.
Completely escaping reality, as opposed to when I spoke to Red Barrels in Montreal, like, the team were so passionate and like put a real big emphasis on realism, because like Outlast is heavily influenced by the real life kind of known information from MK Ultra trials. A lot of really like dark and hard to even comprehend evil, like psychological trials that, you know, some people were subject to. And real life horror is such an interesting, and I guess it's almost like mixing in why humans in general like horror or like true crime things, because we want to almost like self-preservation ways. So Outlast does such a good job of bringing that and those learnings to us as humans in, you know, an interesting and very scary way.
There is that innate perverse desire to learn about grisly things that have actually happened that people just can't get away from, and that's I think that's a powerful tool that a lot of writers use, is, you know, think about what if it were you going through that thing that actually happened, and you just can't help but want to know more about it, even though it's like the worst thing imaginable. You want to stay as far away as you can, but you just can't help yourself.
Can't help yourself.
Yeah. You mentioned the genre earlier, but Souls-like games in general have that typical way of telling stories that are a bit harder for players to maybe grasp because they have to go out of their way. But a game that has Souls-like mechanics and just injects the story across everything it's doing is actually the Star Wars Jedi series, which kind of tackles it in a different way. And I see why, because Star Wars as a franchise is very big, very mainstream. And so for them to try and tell a story in the same way like Dark Souls would be probably a bit abrasive for the typical audience of Star Wars games.
It's very cinematic.
Yeah, it is. And they have found like they've done a really good job in many ways with the Jedi series. One, they picked an incredible moment in the timeline, so that Star Wars fans who want to know more about that gap in their knowledge are going to be thrilled with the fact that it's happening after the big Jedi purge, but before sort of the fall of the Empire. And there's a lot in there that is ripe for storytelling magic. But they've also been brave enough to like tap into parts of the lore that haven't really been covered too much in the movies, which I think is what most people have seen of Star Wars. It's fair to say not everyone's watched all the TV series, not everyone's played all the other games. So sort of leaning on, here's what you know about the movies, here's what we're going to introduce you to, and then that can be that gateway into other like parts of Star Wars, whether it's the cartoons or whether it's the even the anime bits or even the comics, whatever. The Jedi series is a great way to onboard people into thinking bigger than just the films in terms of the story. Plus, they've just picked a great selection of characters for you to meet. Playing as Cal Kestis is great, but it's everyone he meets along the way on the Mantis crew, and speaking to like the Night Sisters, and so many portions of the galaxy that have great characters for Cal to learn from. Because ultimately, the way I see the Jedi series is that it's a story about a kid who now has to find his way in the galaxy without his master, and is also expected to, and has this great weight on his shoulders of knowing I'm part of something that used to be important and big and a force for good that's now gone, but I still feel like I need to give that back to the world, but I'm now up against it because it's just me and a little crew of people. How do I achieve this?
Yeah, and that fear that he must be feeling as well. You really do get a sense of that and the grand scheme of things. Great hero, but great villains as well that you have to come across. Man.
Yeah, absolutely. Coming up against the Inquisitors, coming up against just Jedi from previous era it's so Star Wars manages to tap into both sci-fi and magical fantasy all at once, which is great for them because they have all these genres to pull from. But they do it in a very traditional storytelling sense. It's always the hero's journey. It's always about how does the hero overcome good or overcome bad things. And it's so simple, but it's simple for a reason. We just love it. We just love it. Good. And it's fun, and it's backed up by great mechanics. They treat game mechanics as a storytelling tool and device because it is Metroidvania as well. So Cal won't be able to access certain parts of the map until he learns a certain skill. And they don't just mean like, oh, he gets a skill point and now he can do this. They mean he has to overcome something. He has to learn something better than himself. He has to become more in order to wall run, for example. And now that he can wall run, now he can get to another part of the map. So it's like a really great narrative tool that links back to the gameplay. They've done that very, very cleverly to make players feel like every time they're getting some more story, you also get some more game, because now you're moving to a new section or whatever it happens to be, a new level, new planet, you know.
It's a fantastic example of how a like huge IP franchise can still be super successful, not just because of its name.
Yeah.
Taking a story that isn't just Luke and Leia and making a game out of it, how that can still be successful in the game medium is really impressive, while upholding a lot of the core parts that make the story interesting, but also like introducing completely new areas or untold things to make it so unique and interesting.
They take nothing for granted, I think. Yeah, you're right. It's not like, oh, they're just gonna love it because they're Star Wars fans. We love it because we're Star Wars fans, because we're appreciating how much you're giving to us. And then people who aren't even Star Wars fans will play it and love it as well, because it's not exclusionary. It's just a great story. You immediately get it. You're a guy who's lost in this world. What are you going to do about it, though? Because you have the opportunity to make the world a better place. So what are you going to do? It's great. Similarly, Star Wars Outlaws has a lot of that kind of authenticity baked into it that Star Wars fans really appreciate, but it tells a different tale in that it loses a bit of the fantasy side of it, because you're playing someone who can't use the Force, doesn't use lightsabers. Instead, it's much more of a down-to-earth scoundrel story, which is the beauty of Star Wars, in that it's so vast,
so broad,
that it can cater to whatever you want. The same with like Star Wars Squadrons. You're a fighter pilot now, and you're experiencing, it's that dual narrative thing again. You get to see one side story, you get to see the other side story. Even with, like, it sounds weird to say, but Star Wars Battlefront 2, you got to play as Iden Versio, who is part of Inferno Squad for the Empire, but you get to experience her journey coming to terms with like, what we're doing is actually pretty terrible, and her like progression and narrative in that, like, which isn't something you'd expect out of a game like Battlefront, because you think, oh, that's just a multiplayer game, it's just for like popping heads and playing on Hoth. But actually there are deep story and character development layers baked into all of these games that make them excellent for enjoying the story of it. But the fact they're backed up with great gameplay is like an added bonus.
Henry, what have we learned today? Why are story games, and single player ones specifically, so lovable? We love them because of the characters that are in it. We've got Cal Kestis, Geralt of Rivia, we've got huge names, Arthur Morgan, iconic people that we love to become. BJ Blazkowicz, like, we want to step into their shoes. V from Cyberpunk. We step into their shoes and see the world through theirs and their compatriots, and we learn to love these characters as if we actually know them. And as well as adversely, like playing games like the Elder Scrolls, or even to some extent like Mass Effect, where you're still Commander Shepard, but it's your own hero. It's your take on things. It's you
here's
are
the story.
playing it.
What are you gonna change about it? How are you gonna affect the story yourself? Like with Baldur's Gate, you get to choose which characters you ride or die with. Shadowheart, you die.
No.
And then see what effect that has on the world and the outcome. The reason these story games are so good is that they're personal and then become intimate as well. Like, you will remember the littlest things about them for so long, because the games took the time to let you love them and build that relationship up with its characters, with its world, with the plot, with the pacing of it as well. And so
there's different world elements that you can fall in love with, like Cyberpunk is such a good example of this sprawling city, or like GTA even as well. Like I love Los Santos and the little things that you overhear because of just roaming around exploring this story, but the little things that you pick up too.
Definitely.
You can play it, you can love them because of how realistic they are, or how escaping that they are as well, how far removed from our world that they can be, or how much that they stick with us in working out how we are traveling through this crazy old thing called life as well. We've obviously left out a huge amount of titles that are so fantastic that we've played and appreciate, that we know that you've played and appreciate. So please do share with us below some of your must play single player story games, and also, if you can, the reason why you love it so much. It's hard sometimes to be like, why do I like that a lot? But I think we've had a go today.
Think about it. Have a little think. Drop the comment. If you like this video, leave it a like, and we'll see you in the next one. Thanks so much for watching.
Bye.
Bye-bye.